On this Andy's Autosport Manufacturer Spotlight, we're talking with John Endacott from National Standard Parts. John, welcome.
Bill, great to be here.
All right, we appreciate you today. Now, we've got, you guys have a string of connectors here that are just fantastic. Now, I've been using them for years for some things. We're going to talk about the benefits, and I want you to show us and show our customers how to properly crimp and how to properly use your connectors, and let's talk a little bit about those.
Certainly will. NSPA was one of the pioneers of heat shrink terminals, and really the way heat shrink terminals came about was with some of the limitations of existing connectors out there. Your standard type of crimp connector, one of the major problems that you have is when you insert your wire and you go to crimp that part, well, your wire is going to be exposed to moisture, salts, and other contaminants. Over time, what happens is that wire can corrode. It'll turn black or green. Then as current runs on that wire, it will actually accelerate the corrosion process, and you'll see where that corrosion creep will work underneath the wire insulation, and as that sets in and corrosion develops, it builds up resistance within your electrical system.
Right.
And you're not getting the proper voltage to your various electrical components. And so the great thing about heat shrink connectors is that they were designed, you put a piece of adhesive lined heat shrink tubing over this, insert that wire into the connector, and that heat shrink tubing has an adhesive or a glue on the inside which that adheres to the wire insulation. Then when you shrink the tubing down to the wire, it's going to completely seal that and prevent any moisture or salts to come in contact with the wire.
Now, one of the things that this is real important, one of the reasons this is really important is, let's talk about sensors in your car if you're wiring a standalone engine management system. This is real important because the current is what the computer reads to make sure that those sensors stay in spec. So this will solve that problem. Now, we've seen that in our race car. We race at Bonneville Salt Flats, and every year we would basically have to rewire our car because of exactly what you're talking about. Since we've started using these terminals, though, that doesn't happen anymore.
Right, and that was one of the main benefits of coming out with when you have wiring applications where it's going to be exposed to the elements, you want to make sure that you have a watertight seal. When most of your electrical components today is when they come off the assembly line, everything is a sealed molded part. Right. And so if you're going to add an accessory, make a repair on your vehicle, you need to be making sure that you're making a sealed repair to maintain the integrity of that wire harness system. And that's what these heat shrink terminals were designed to do.
Okay. Now, for aftermarket things, let's say I put a set of fog lights on my car. Those are kind of exposed to the elements too down front. So these connectors are still going to allow all that moisture in there. So that's going to be a problem. You know, you guys have come up with some really innovative things now. Actually, before we get into that, let's talk about how to properly install one of your terminals and actually show the limitations and what happens to one of these when we do it.
In the aftermarket, the most popular connectors that you're going to come across are butt connectors or butt splices. And what they're generally, they account for almost 70% of the overall usage in the aftermarket. And that's joining one wire to another. And when I go to insert this wire into this vinyl connection, even though I don't see the wire, you can see that moisture, salts can still come in contact between where the wire insulation is and the insulation on your connector.
Sure.
And so that even though you're not able to see it, this can also may even be more damaging because you're not able to see the corrosion that's setting in on that, and you're not able to verify that.
Kind of a false sense of security. You think you're okay, but you really don't know.
Exactly.
Okay.
But with the heat shrink connector, and what I'm going to do is the most common, the most economical of all the heat shrink connectors, which is the crimp and heat shrink. And really, it's almost to install this is very similar to a standard type of crimp connector. You're going to strip your wire. You're going to strip it about 1/4 inch. You insert that till it hits the wire stop. You're going to grab your crimp tool, and you want to make sure that you're using a crimp tool that's designed to crimp insulated connectors. Now, this is a multi-purpose tool, and so I've got a cutter up here at the nose, another cutter back here, a wire stripper here, but these first two die sets are designed for insulated connectors. Now, this third die set, it says for non-insulated connectors. If I were to use that die set and try to crimp that, that's going to pierce through the tubing, and ultimately you're going to destroy what you've just paid extra to have.
Right.
And so you need to make sure that you crimp it in the proper crimp nest. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to position that crimp tool right in the center of that crimp barrel. I'm going to make sure that my wire is fully seated, and I'm going to crimp that. And I actually, this tubing that we use is manufactured by 3M. It's manufactured here in Massachusetts, and it's a very high quality tubing, and it's really designed to be able to withstand the crimp force.
Yeah, that's one of the things that happens with these, and I'm sure we'll see that in a minute. But when you do these plastic ones, that just kind of pinches out sometimes, and a lot of times it'll expose that metal. So you really, after you're done crimping with one of these, you really need to put some tape over it.
Right, and that's the problem with, especially with the most economical of the insulated terminals. When you crimp it, you can almost see where that can get discolored. It can crack. Then if it's exposed to the UV rays, then that's also going to break down that PVC or vinyl insulation, and it can actually become brittle and crack off the connector.
Right.
And then you run the risk, if that wire, if that insulation isn't intact, you can be concerned about a short.
Sure.
So here, to finish out this installation, I'm going to take my wire, insert it into the other end of the crimp barrel. Again, make sure I'm using the proper crimp nest. Center the crimp tool there. Get a good crimp. I'm going to do a little pull, tug on that, make sure I've got a good termination.
Right.
Then I'm going to put it to a heat source. And you can really use either heat source. You can use a hot air gun or a butane torch, and we'll demonstrate both here. But I like the butane torch just because of the portability of it. But anytime, you also just need to be careful because this puts out 2400 Fahrenheit temperature. You need to make sure you're not getting too close to the wire insulation to burn the wire insulation. But you start at one in the center, work your way out to one end, do the same to the other. Once you shrink your tubing down, you'll see the adhesive.
You actually can see it. You can actually see it stick into the wire. That's excellent.
What you can see is there's a
it's coming
clear
out.
adhesive that adheres out, and what that does is that provides that barrier to prevent any moisture or salts to come in contact to corrode your wire.
Fantastic.
And so once you make that repair, you let the shrink tubing cool, and you're going to have a permanent repair that's going to last as long as your wire.
Now you have this same connector. Now that was a crimp style. Now you have the same connector in a solder style connection as well.
We do, and I can demonstrate that for you as well. This is a crimp and solder version.
Now that has solder inside of this wide spot of the barrel?
Yes, and to give you kind of how this works, although this is a different type of connector, we use a similar bare part. It has a window that's kind of cut in the center there. And so you can see there's a little square or rectangle that's cut in the middle. Right. Then there's a wire stop. And then so that's the bare part, crimp bare part that we use. But then what we do is then we cover that with a solder sleeve, a low temperature solder sleeve. And so when I go to install that solder will actually flow into that opening and solder your wire to your crimp barrel.
So now on that, here's a question on that. Now this right here obviously is still, it's obviously not squeezed down all the way, or not, the heat shrink hasn't shrunk all the way. So when you put the heat to this and that solder melts, does that heat shrink actually forces that solder to go into the connector? Is that what it does?
It helps the process. And solder is going to flow to where the heat is.
Right.
And so ultimately what you want to do is, and that's the reason you don't want to just isolate when you're heating this just in the center section. You want to heat all across the entire crimp barrel because, as I said, solder is attracted to the heat. Yeah,
it's drawn in. I know, and that's one of the things. We have the soldering iron right here, but that's one of the things that happens when people don't solder connectors correctly usually, and they try to heat the solder instead of heating the wire, and then let the solder draw into the wire.
And they can get a cold solder joint there, and really it might appear that they've got a good termination, and they really don't.
Another false sense of security.
Exactly. And so with these, and that's what we've done with this is our solder sleeve has been pre-fluxed. What flux does is it helps clean the wire, clean the metal, so that you ensure that you get a good solder joint, and it's just the right amount of solder for this application. And so it takes the guesswork out of the installation process. And so here, it's really no different than if I were installing just the standard crimp. I strip my wire, I insert it into the crimp barrel, again making sure that I'm using the right crimp nest. And then here I'm going to make sure that I'm just in this case, just to the left of that, where that solder sleeve is, and in the center of that crimp barrel. I'm going to crimp that down, do the same to the other side.
So this is actually really cool because you actually get both. You get the crimp and the solder side of it, along with all the sealing from the heat shrink as well.
That's exactly right. And a lot of people like this, and from just a pure soldering, sometimes it can be challenging when you're trying to solder. what this does, it actually holds the wires in place.
Okay.
So when I insert that wire and crimp it down, not only do I get that mechanical termination, but then it also makes it so my wires aren't going to move around.
Right.
They're going to stay in place and make sure that I'm going to get a good solder joint.
Yeah, a lot of times on that, what you always have to have, you know, they have those little tools where you have the two little clamps that hold the wire together. You don't need that with these.
You don't need that with this. This is kind of it. It's already, when you crimp it, those are your two clamps.
Here's a question. Now, on this,
Yes.
is our heat gun hot enough to,
Yes.
to melt that solder?
Yes, and a lot of times too, with various heat guns, they have deflector shields and other things that can protect some other electrical components. And so those are always nice to have, especially if you're working in a tight area, to have some deflector shields to kind of isolate the heat. The other thing that it does is, like with this one here, as I'm heating this, it takes a little bit of time for the heat gun to kind of really warm up. But you can see here, the tubing's starting to shrink down.
Sure is.
And if you have a deflector shield on here, you really don't need to spin your wire at all, because that heat will then come around to the other side. So you can see now that the tubing is completely adhered to the wire insulation. Then what I'm going to do is I have to heat it a little bit longer to get that solder to flow. Now if I were using a torch, I want to make sure that I'm heating across the entire solder barrel, but because of the diameter of this heat source, you'll see that it's actually heating the entire crimp barrel.
I'm seeing the solder come into the wire right now.
It's starting to break down and flow, but what you'll see is that solder will turn like a bright silvery color, which it's starting to do right now. Once you see that happen, you remove it from your heat source and you let that cool, and you'll actually be able to see that window.
Yep.
And what happens is that solder flows into that window, solders your wire to your crimp barrel. Now this will take about 2-3 minutes for that to set up and cure and cool. But once this thing cools, with a 14 gauge wire, which is the most popular, if we were to put this up to a pull test and pull this, your wire would actually break before you could pull those two wires apart. Wow. And that wire would break about 110, 115 pounds, but you'd have both of your wires still soldered together there.
Still connected. And
that's the other main benefit of heat shrink connectors is, one, you're going to stop wire corrosion, which we talked about.
Sure.
And that was the primary reason they came about. But what the heat shrink does as well is, with a standard connector, all you have is just where you've crimped that to the wire. Here, you actually shrink the tubing down, it adheres to the wire insulation, and provides additional tensile strength and strain relief.
It helps hold them together, right.
And so especially when you're talking about applications with off-roading, racing, you get a great deal of high vibration. And then you compound that with different changes in temperatures. And so when you just have a crimp termination and you go operating a vehicle that goes from extreme, from 105 degrees out there and then going into something where it's 30 degrees, well, those metals are going to expand and contract at different rates. And then over time, as that happens and you've got the vibration,
it's going to pull
you can
apart.
have where the wire pulls loose.
Sure.
That's not going to happen with these connectors either.
Excellent. Now so let's talk. You have other styles besides this. Of course, you have all the other like the other types of terminations and things like that. You have spade terminals. What all of the terminals do you offer, and what size wires can we use with these connectors?
Basically, with the crimp line is the broadest line that we have with the crimp and the heat shrink, and we carry that on the large size, going from 8 gauge connectors to the small gauge going up to 24 gauge wire. So that's going to handle from 8 gauge is primarily
pretty good size stereos.
You're getting into a lot of applications onto your tractors and trailers when you get to that size wire.
Oh, of course. There you go.
And then on the 22 gauge side, 24 gauge, that's your smallest. Any of your small wires, it's going to go as small to that as well.
We run a lot of 24 gauge when we do our standalone engine management systems, because they run real small wires that basically run to the sensors. So those would be great for that.
And really, when you're dealing with the smaller wires, I'd even recommend using the solder connections at that point, because when you're dealing with like a 22, 24 gauge wire, when you go to crimp that in there, because the wire strands are so fine, it's not that difficult to actually cut through the wires.
Hard to cut through it. I mean, hard not,
to cut the wire strands as you're going to crimp it. And so here, you can use this crimp and solder one. You go to crimp it and give it just to hold that wire in place, but then that solder is going to actually flow into that, solder your wire to a crimp barrel. You're going to make sure that you're getting maximum current flow because of that solder termination and maximum strength.
Okay, now let's talk about SEMA last year. You guys had a pretty neat event happen at SEMA.
Yes. really, when we started making heat shrink connectors in the early 80s, and we were one of the pioneers of doing that, our ultimate goal was how can we make better terminations, because we realized that people were having problems with their electrical connections. Now, once you get to the point with these solder connections, when it's stronger than the wire, you're getting maximum current flow, it's tough to have a better termination than that.
Sure.
And so now what we're trying to do is how can we make it easier for the user installer to make sure that they've installed it properly. And that was with our latest connector here, our OptiSeal connector. And again, what we ended up doing is we took the window butt connector that we use on our crimp and solder and made a couple modifications to it. What we've done is we put a color stripe in the center of that crimp barrel, and that serves two purposes. One, it indicates what size wire gauge to use, blue being for 14/16. Now we also have the wire gauge imprinted on the tubing, so I mean, we definitely are making sure we try to cover our bases so people are using the right wire with the right connector.
Sure.
But it's also a great, what that does is a lot of times when someone's installing the product is they can strip their wire too short, or it's not fully seated when they go to grab their crimp tool. And so with this product is if I don't see my wire hit the wire stop,
you know you're not in all the way.
I know there's a problem. Either I haven't stripped my wire long enough, or it's not fully seated. And so when I go in there, I want to make sure that one, that I can see the wire. When I go to grab my crimp tool, here is I want to make sure that that's fully seated as I go to crimp that, and I put that crimp tool right over the blue line so that I know I'm crimping the center of the crimp barrel.
Yep, you got the crimp barrel, and you can see the wire, of course, at the center of the window.
And so I'm going to do the same thing to the other side here, is strip my wire, insert it into the crimp barrel, grab my crimp tool, center it right on that blue line, make sure it's fully seated, crimp that down, and then I can see both of those wires. And so I've got that visual inspection.
Yeah, you can verify that you've got it in there exactly where you need it to be.
And so then the other thing that came about that made this connector unique is that we are using this crystal clear adhesive line heat shrink tubing, where there's been clear adhesive line shrink tubing, but it's like this.
It's not really clear.
It's a milky clear, so to speak. And so this was one of the unique things about this this tubing is that it does have that adhesive lining, but it's a crystal clear tubing.
Now you also have, were talking earlier about a connector that you have that you can actually install, because I know there's sometimes when you put 2 or 3 wires in one side and you need it just to terminate to one, and you have a connector like that as well.
Yes, and so with that connector is it's kind of unique as well. It's a traditional step-down connector, but some of the problems with the step-down connector, and I think I might have something here, well, a little different size here, but what you can see is that it's a tapered down design, and so you've got a uniform copper wall, so it makes it easy to crimp. And what a traditional step-down connector would be is that they would take a connector that was designed like a blue 14/16, they would put a reducer in there, a copper reducer in there.
Yes.
And basically that would accommodate the smaller wire. But then when you go to try to crimp that, I mean, you almost have to be a gorilla to be able to actually get a good mechanical termination on there, because the amount of force that's required because of the copper, the wall thickness of that copper almost prevents you from getting a good mechanical connection.
Right.
And so what we've done is we've tapered down that design, we put the window in there, and then what we use is a unique type of tubing that actually will seal between multiple wires. And so how you would install this product is it's typically with our products that you're installing the wire about a quarter, 5/16 of an inch. Well, with this, at least on the 2-wire side, that you're going to need to strip your wire a little bit longer, about a 1/2 inch.
Okay.
And so for this type of connector, the blue indicates what size wires you're going to use. So this is going to allow me to put 2 14-gauge wires in on one side, going to 114 or 116-gauge wire on the other side.
Okay, so to be clear on this, now any of these connectors that you have like this, because I see we have a yellow and a red here. So the yellow is the small size. That's the 14 or the 10.
10-12, right?
That's the 10-12. So you can put 2 10-12s on this side. So you always go by whatever the smaller the 2 wires is, and then you can put 2 of those on the opposite side.
Exactly, and the tubing. The print on the tubing indicates what size wire that it's designed for. So blue being that, hey, this is designed for 14/16. The yellow print on this tubing is designed for its 10-12.
Right.
Then we also have one here for red. That's designed where you can put On the blue side, I can put two 18s, two 20s, two 22 gauge wires,
Gotcha.
to 118, 120, 122 on the other side.
And then the heat. Another thing about that is the heat shrink will still shrink down over that single and the double, which is kind of interesting because usually that runs into a problem.
Right. With all of these other connectors that we've demonstrated, they're really only designed to seal and insulate
A single wire.
A single wire. This tubing, one, has a higher shrink ratio. Most adhesive line heat shrink tubing has a shrink ratio of 3 to 1. This actually has a shrink ratio of 4 to 1. So it's going to be able to cover a much broader range of wire applications, but it also has a real active runny adhesive.
Right.
And that's designed to seal in between multiple wires. And so I haven't really shown how to use the stripping tool, but on this stripping tool, this multi-purpose tool, is that this is actually made in the U.S. as well. It's made up in Illinois, just outside of Chicago, and everything is precision ground. And then you've got an indicator here to strip your solid wires on this side, and an indicator here to strip your
cut, stranded, and solid. Very good.
Exactly. And so because this is about 5/16 of an inch right here, and it needs to be about a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to go in here and take about another 1/8 of an inch off here.
Now it's real interesting. Now that brings up a point because obviously a 14 gauge should be 14 gauge, right?
Right.
But a 14 gauge is actually a 12 solid, so they are actually different. So you can't. So that's excellent on that tool. That's
right.
That's
and so they spell it out for you. The other thing that's nice is, I mean, there are cheaper tools out there, but you get what you pay for. I mean, when you get a cheaper tool, a lot of these times when you go to try to crimp it in, the handles
slide off.
Well, the handles slide off. There's so little padding, you almost feel like the handles are coming right through the palm of your hand.
Yeah.
Then when you go to try to strip a wire that small, all you're going to do is bend it.
Right.
Which
is going to create which can create a problem with the wire too.
And you can cut the wire strands. I mean, you can see right here that when I cut a small little piece, like 1/8 of an inch off of there, there's not one wire strand that was cut during that process. And so for the 2-wire side here is, I've already stripped one, another. But what we do is we actually recommend that you kind of twist the wires together a little bit.
Sure.
One, it helps make sure that both of them are going to get in there and be fully seated. It also builds up the mass a little bit to make sure that you can get a good crimp. But again, you have that window butt connector there. And so I want to make sure that I see those wires, that they're fully seated. I'm going to use this. This is a ratchet crimp tool here.
I love that tool.
And the benefit of a ratchet crimp tool is, regardless of the user installer, you're going to get the same crimp time after time. This is what we submitted to UL to get the UL approval on our connectors, because you're going to get the same termination time after time.
Well, not only that, that's kind of gear reduced too, so you don't have to be a big gorilla in order to be able to do it. Just about anybody can do that because it's all gear reduced and all that, so it's really kind of neat. And then it won't release until it goes all the way and gets connected.
Until it's fully cycled,
right.
and that you're getting the right crimp force. And so if you're going to be doing a number of terminations, that this is going to ensure that you're getting the highest quality crimp and a uniform crimp, because when you crimp this, Bill, you're going to end up probably crimping it a lot harder than I am, just being a stronger guy than me. But so, I mean, this is going to vary from user to user how you crimp. Now, this is still a great quality tool.
No.
And for somebody that's not doing them all the time, and it does have a lot of multi-purpose, but it really just depends on how often you're using it.
Sure.
So here you can see that I've crimped the wires here. Then on the single wire side, what I'm going to do is insert the wire here. Again, sometimes the adhesive, because there's so much adhesive when we go to make this product, you might feel a little resistance right there. You want to kind of force it through.
Push through the adhesive a little bit.
Just push through that adhesive a little bit. Make sure it's fully seated. And again, you can just use this. So
I love that crimp tool.
Crimp that down. I can see all my wires right there. Then I put it to the heat source. You can use a hot air gun, a butane torch. Start at the center. I generally go to the short side first and shrink that down, and that doesn't need as much heat because that's that single wire.
Right.
But when I go to this side, and you can see that the tubing's offset on these connectors, and that's done intentionally because what we want is a little more tubing on the 2-wire side, so it can actually have more room for that adhesive to seal between all of those wires.
Look at that adhesive going right in there. Boy, it's just sucking right inside those 2 wires too.
Now, the more I heat this, the more that adhesive is going to ooze out of that. You can see right there how much that's oozing out of both sides there. Now once I shrink that down, but I mean you can just kind of get an indication here how much adhesive.
Wow.
So that's going to fully seal both of those wires, prevent any moisture. Now you can see here a little adhesive came out of here as well. That's going to completely seal. If there was any issues with the tubing, it's going to seal, provide all the dielectric strength that you need.
Kind of like fix a flat.
Exactly, exactly. But where you see these applications, a lot of times people have used Scotch locks.
Right.
And most maintenance managers, I mean, they pull their hair out dealing with those because they know it's going to be a problem 6-9 months down the road.
After you put them, you get to put them on one time and then they're done. And when you take them off, it's an issue or there's all kinds of problems. Absolutely.
And where we're located in the southeast, and boating's such a big part of the, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a boat trailer where their stop tail turn light doesn't work.
Yeah.
Most of the times it's because it's an application with a wire harness. They had 2 wires going to one, and if they were using this connector, they back that boat trailer right into the off the boat ramp. Those lights are sitting in
where the tail lights and everything go into the water, right?
And they need something that is actually designed for to be sealed.
Well, again, how I came about these was we got tired of rewiring our race car for Bonneville salt flats every year. So this has been a godsend to me. I don't have to rewire my car every year. So that's been great. So what else do we have here? You have all kinds of different connectors. Let's talk about what you have. We have the ring connectors, and what else do you have?
With the crimp line of connectors, as I said, we go from the large size where basically it can accommodate something up to an 8 gauge wire, which will allow you to do the 210s or the 212s on the one side. But then you get out all the way to 24 gauge wire. So 8 to 24 gauge. Then you have it in the butt connectors, which are the most common, which is what we've demonstrated. But your ring terminals, and you're going to have it generally from a number 6 stud all the way up to a 3/8 stud.
Okay.
On the larger stud connectors, on the 10, 12, and 8, we carry it all the way up to a 1/2 inch stud size. We do have spade terminals as well on this line. We've got your standard spade terminals, but then we also have your captive spade. So if you're in the marine industry and those things, ABYC, the American Boat Yacht Council, says that if you're going to use a spade terminal, it has to be a captive terminal. Right. And what the captive spade terminals are, they're either a flange spade. So when you're putting that onto a machine screw, like mounting it onto a terminal block, well, if that machine screw loosens, with a standard spade, it can just pull it loose.
Out. Yeah.
With a flange spade, with those 2 hooks on it's going to hold onto that machine screw. Or you have the spring spade, which actually has like little hooks on the outside that kind of go around the machine screw.
Take a bite around it. Right.
So we have those as well. So we have the captive spades. We also carry a full line of male-female connectors. We have it in the blade style, either non-insulated, fully insulated. So your couplers like this. But then we have it to your bullet plugs as well.
Oh, great.
So a lot of your trailer wiring is going to be bullet plugs. More of your automotive, male, female, marine are going to be more blade style types of connectors. Great. And then, but we also carry that in the crimp and solder as well. We carry all of those various variations. We just don't carry it all the way up to 8 gauge. It's from 10 gauge to 24 gauge in the crimp and solder. But we still have the ring, spades, and male, female quick disconnects. In the multiple wire connectors, we have it where it goes to 2 to 1 wire, but we also have an end cap as well, where if you had 2, 3, 4 wires all coming to a point where you could insert the wires in there, crimp it down here, and then shrink that tubing to those 3, 4 wires to provide a watertight seal.
Fantastic. John, we really appreciate you coming by today and showing us all your product. Guys, you can get this at andysautosport.com. Check out the link below to see what we have available. And we'll hope you've enjoyed this and it's been educational. And we'll see you on another Manufacturer's Spotlight. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Bill.